Well, during that conference, he was asking for the people to become a part of History's Handful, which meant a handful of individuals, each of them giving $1 million for the fulfillment of the Great Commission. 1,200 couples or individuals to fund reaching the entire world. And I felt God moving me and my wife to be involved in that. So that night I talked to Bill Bright and I said, Bill, I really feel like we should be a part of this History's Handful, but we don't have $1 million in our wildest dream. What do you suggest? And he said, Scott, he said, how much money did you give last year? I said, well, we gave $17,000, which was about 35% of our income. My wife and I always felt like we were generous to the Lord. And he says, well, why don't you start the first year with a goal of $50,000? I about choked. $50,000. You know, he's got big faith, and you know, I admired that in him. Okay, we'll go for it. Well, the first year we worked, and we worked hard all year. And some weeks we made overhead, and other weeks we didn't make overhead. And at the very end of the year, we got a phone call from this outfit on the other side of the country, and they were looking for this big machine. And a long story short, God brought a couple of deals to us that were so obviously Him, and we made $50,000 off these deals, and were able to make that commitment. It was absolutely phenomenal. And later I asked this company, how'd you find out about us? Well, they had called a company in Chicago, and they said, oh, for a machine like that, you need to contact Scott Machinery. Well, what they meant was contact Scott Machinery out of Alabama, not Podunk Scott Machinery out of Sacramento. So coincidentally, the wires got crossed and they landed in our lap. Well, just before we were getting ready to write the final check, Satan began to work on me and said, Scott, if you give all the profit away, you're not leaving any money in to prime the pump to get bigger in order to ever give $1 million. You really should retain some of that. Well, yeah, that made logical sense, and I'm wrestling with this. And then I realized it was Satan. And I called my secretary and I said, quick, write the check before I change my mind. And she wrote the check. Well, the next day is the last day of the year, and we're closed for inventory. And about 10 o'clock, I call in. I said, how you guys doing on inventory? And they said, we're done. I said, you're kidding. I said, well, you guys are all there. Do you want to just work today? Yeah, sure. They didn't mind. So they turned and unlocked the door and turned the open sign around and started answering the phone. We did $65,000 in one day, $27,000 of which was profit. God gave back. We had written the check the day before for 30. God gave back nearly the exact amount of what we had written the check for to prime the pump. We were absolutely in shock. You can't imagine. Well, when I had spoken to Bill and he challenged us to give 50, he says, watch what the Lord does to your business. He says, I'll bet the next year you'll be doubling that. Well, we're so in shock, we said, well, let's go for 100. So the next year, we're working on no miracle deals that year. We're just in the battle, just all year working hard. You know, when you're in a battle, you're just shooting. You know, you're not counting bullets. You're just shooting. So at the end of the year, we really didn't know where we were. So my secretary camped out for a day in her office, checking the receivables and the payables. And at the end of the day, she came out and says, we've given $57,000. We could give the remainder. It's going to cut us down to almost nothing, but we could do it. And I began to struggle again. You know, you need cash flow in the business, Scott. You can't give it all out. You've got to maintain some cash flow. And so I went home that night and I told my wife about it. It didn't take her 2 seconds. She says, I'm a signer on the account, and if you don't write the check, I'm going to. So needless to say, God revealed His will, and we wrote the check, and the next year we were able to give $100,000. And we just finished up this past year, and I think we gave around $115,000 to $120,000. I haven't got the final numbers yet. But here we are now, just within 3 years, we are just shy of $300,000, and we are having a blast. I mean, we make some money on a machine, we'll send $5,000 or $10,000, and we are absolutely amazed at how this thing has been adding up. And, you know, every time my wife and I need something, we turn around, and there's still plenty of oil in our jar. There's never anything that we don't have what we need for. And we are just having a blast. And we're actually beginning to see light at the end of the tunnel. I think that I wasn't really convinced that God would do this through us, but I grabbed a hold of 2 Chronicles 16:9 that says The eyes of the Lord look to and fro throughout the whole earth, that he may strongly support those whose heart is completely his. And my heart's been God's ever since the day he grabbed me 13 years ago. And I grabbed a hold of that verse, and I said, Lord, if you want to do it, you give it, we'll give it. And I actually can begin to see that this thing could really happen. We're just amazed. And you know, it reminds me, a couple of years ago, a good friend, Norm Miller, who owns Interstate Batteries, and he invited a number of us to go to the Texas World Speedway and race these NASCARs. And the guy that was in charge said, now folks, don't take the car up over 4,000 RPMs. Well, you know, I'm not a shy guy, and I like an adventure, but I couldn't get the dumb thing up to 4,000 RPMs. I'd go fast down the straightaway, and I'd let off going around the curve. Well, about midday, the guy comes out and says, now look, guys, you're never going to experience the thrill of World Speedway racing until you stick that car in the curve at the same speed you're going down the straightaway. I'm going, oh, man. Well, like a good friend of mine, Ray Berryman, was there, and he said, Scott, he says, it's just like faith. And see, this guy owns these cars, and he doesn't want them wrecked. And he says they'll stick if you put them in the curve. You just got to believe. Well, of course, that's simple enough. So then the guy says, now you can go up to 5,500 RPMs. Well, I had this newfound faith that I got out there, and I cranked that thing up to 5,500 RPMs. I guess that's about 150 miles an hour. And I'm going down the straightaway, and I'm heading for that curve, and I put it in there. And I'm telling you what, it was the thrill of a lifetime, but I was scared to death. My knuckles were white as sheets. I'm strapped into the driver's seat. My guts are over here in the passenger seat. I just know I'm going to slam that wall coming out of the turn, but I must have missed it by 3 inches, and I had a blast. And I experienced the thrill of World Speedway racing. Well, I'm telling you, as a Christian, I now believe that there's no way that you can experience the thrill of the abundant life that Christ came to give us until we're willing to line our lives up with what the Scripture says and hang it right out there. And that's what we're experiencing. This is the miracle that we're experiencing in our life.